The ranch had stood for generations. Built by my great-great-grandfather, it had weathered storms, droughts, and countless changes in the world around it. Its wooden beams carried the scent of history, and its fields whispered stories of long days and harder nights.
To me, it was more than just land.
It was my family legacy. When I moved back to the ranch after years of city living, I thought it would be a quiet life. I imagined mornings with the sun rising over the hills, evenings with the cattle grazing peacefully, and the comforting silence of the countryside. But peace did not last long. The Homeowners Association had crept into the surrounding area over the years. What used to be wide open country was now a patchwork of new houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and strict rules. Rules about everything from what color you could paint your porch to how tall your grass could grow. I never thought they would bother with me. After all, my ranch was older than their bylaws, older than their entire neighborhood. But I was wrong. It started with letters slipped under my door. Complaints about the old fencing that lined my property. Notes about the barn that they said looked too weathered for the community standard. One letter even suggested I should repaint my ranch house to match the newer homes. I crumpled them up and tossed them aside. This was my land, and I had no intention of turning it into a polished subdivision. Then came the knocks on my door. Karen, the head of the HOA board, stood there one Saturday morning with 2 other members flanking her like bodyguards. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. She told me that the ranch was out of compliance with their neighborhood rules. She said my cattle made too much noise, my barn was an eyesore, and the historic ranch sign at the front gate was against HOA guidelines. I laughed. This ranch had been here for a century and a half. Her HOA had been here for less than 20 years. I told her plainly that the land was mine, and I would not change a thing. Her smile vanished. That is when the real trouble began. The HOA began filing complaints with the county, trying to get fines imposed on me. They sent more letters. They even called the sheriff, claiming I was breaking community regulations. But every time officials came out, they shook their heads. The ranch was grandfathered and older than the HOA itself. They had no power here. Still, they would not stop. I started attending their meetings just to see what they were plotting. The moment I walked in the room, the chatter fell to silence. Karen would glare at me, as if I had no right to be there. But I listened, and I realized something important. Their bylaws allowed any resident in the district to run for a board position, even someone like me. So I ran. At first they laughed, thinking no one would vote for the rancher on the hill. But the more neighbors I spoke to, the more I realized how tired people were of Karen's control. Families whispered about being fined for kids' bikes left in the driveway, or for flowers planted outside the approved color scheme. The HOA had become less about community and more about power. When election day came, the turnout was larger than anyone expected. Karen sat smug at the front of the room, certain she would be reelected. But as the ballots were counted, her expression began to crack. One by one, the votes piled in my favor. When the final count was announced, the room erupted. I had won. I was now the president of the HOA, the very group that had tried to drive me off my own land. Karen sat frozen in her chair, unable to speak. Neighbors who had once avoided my ranch now came forward to shake my hand. They told me it was time for change, and that I was the one to lead it. As I looked out at that crowd, I felt the weight of history on my shoulders. The ranch had survived for 150 years. And now it would shape the future of this community too. But deep down I knew Karen was not done yet. Her silence was not surrender. It was only the beginning of something else. The room slowly began to clear after the election results were announced. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering about how things might finally change for the better. Karen, however, stayed seated at the front, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as if she was holding on to the last bit of control she had. I walked toward her, not to taunt her, but to make it clear that the days of intimidation were over. She stood before I reached her, and without a word stormed out of the hall, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed, and the room went silent again for a moment. It was clear to everyone that Karen would not accept what had just happened. The following days were strangely quiet. I expected her to appear on my ranch with more threats or new letters demanding changes. But there was nothing. Instead, I started receiving visits from neighbors I had barely spoken to before. They came to tell me about the fines they had been forced to pay, the rules they had been threatened with, and the fear they felt when dealing with Karen. It became clear that her control over the HOA was built on fear and manipulation. Now, with me in charge, they were finally ready to push back. One evening, as I sat on the porch of my ranch watching the sun dip behind the hills, a pickup truck pulled into my driveway. It was Tom, a neighbor who had lived just beyond the edge of the new development for years. He leaned against the truck and told me that Karen had already started gathering a small group of loyal board members in secret meetings. She was trying to figure out a way to reverse the election or force me out before I could make any real changes. I nodded because I knew Karen well enough by now to realize she would never stop quietly. The land meant power to her, not history, not legacy, not community. I thanked Tom and assured him that I would be ready. The next HOA board meeting came quickly. I walked into the hall with a folder under my arm filled with notes and ideas for easing some of the harsh rules that had been strangling the neighborhood. But as soon as I entered, I could feel the tension. Karen sat at the far end of the table, a smirk playing on her face. She had papers in front of her and a group of her allies sitting tightly together. The meeting began, and she wasted no time. She stood and announced that she had found a loophole in the bylaws. According to her interpretation, my ranch was not part of the neighborhood that elected the HOA. Therefore, she claimed I was not eligible to hold the position of president. Gasps filled the room, and the board members shifted nervously in their seats. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my response. I slowly opened the folder I had brought and laid out documents that had been in my family for generations. Property maps, county deeds, and legal records, all showing that the HOA boundaries overlapped with the ranch. I explained that their own filings included my land when they expanded years ago.
Karen went silent.
Her smirk faltered as she realized what I had done. The neighbors leaned forward, murmuring as they saw the proof laid out clearly. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. But deep down, I knew she would not let it end there. She had too much pride and too much need for control to ever simply walk away. The room buzzed with whispers as the documents passed from hand to hand. Several neighbors leaned closer to study the seals and county signatures printed on the old papers, their eyes widening with each detail they read. Finally, one of the older board members cleared his throat and said it was undeniable the ranch was part of the neighborhood, and my position as president was valid. A wave of relief rippled through the room, but it was quickly replaced with tension as Karen slammed her hand on the table. She accused me of forging the documents, of tricking everyone with clever lies, but her words carried no weight anymore. The neighbors who once feared her now stared at her with tired eyes. Some even shook their heads, muttering under their breath about how far she had gone to cling to power. I sat quietly, letting her outburst echo through the hall because I knew silence was stronger than shouting. When she finally stopped, the room was still. I told everyone that my goal was not revenge against Karen, but a fair and balanced HOA, one that respected both the new residents and the history of the land. I promised to cut unnecessary fines, reduce ridiculous rules, and focus on building a community where people could live without fear. Applause broke out, not loud at first, but steady and sincere. Karen sat back down, her face red and her shoulders stiff, as if she had been cornered for the first time. After the meeting, neighbors approached me with handshakes, smiles, and quiet words of support. It felt as though a wall of fear had cracked and people were ready to step into the light. But as I walked back to my truck that night, I noticed Karen standing near the edge of the parking lot. She was talking to two men. I did not recognize both of them, nodding at her words, their expressions hard. I climbed into the truck and drove off, but the image stayed with me. Karen was not finished. She was plotting again, this time not through loopholes or rules, but with something far more personal. I knew she would not stop until she felt she had regained control or destroyed everything I stood for. And as the days passed, I could sense the storm she was preparing growing darker and closer with each hour. The next morning, I woke to the sound of boots crunching gravel outside my ranch. I stepped onto the porch and saw Karen standing with the two men I had noticed before. They looked rough, weathered faces, eyes sharp and calculating, as if they had done this kind of thing many times before. Karen stood with her arms crossed, a thin smile tugging at her lips. She told me she was giving me one last chance to step down as president and hand over control of the HOA. Her voice carried the smug confidence of someone who thought she had already won. I looked at the men, then back at her, and calmly asked if she really wanted to play this game on land that had belonged to my family for over a century. The men shifted uncomfortably, as though my words carried more weight than they expected. I reminded them that the property was private, that trespassing came with serious consequences. Still, Karen pressed on, saying she was not afraid of my threats. She claimed she had connections, people who could make my life difficult. But what she did not realize was that my connections ran deeper than she ever imagined. Before I could say more, a familiar truck rolled up the drive, and the county sheriff stepped out. He was an old friend of my family, a man who had grown up riding horses on the same land Karen was now trying to control. He asked what was going on, his tone calm but firm. Karen stammered, trying to spin the story, claiming I had intimidated her and that she felt unsafe. But the sheriff knew better. He looked at the men, then at Karen, and asked if they were planning on breaking the law today. Silence hung heavy in the air. The men glanced at one another, then quietly stepped back away from Karen, clearly not wanting to get tangled in her schemes any longer. Karen sputtered, insisting they stay, but they turned and walked down the drive, leaving her standing there alone. The sheriff warned her that trespassing on my ranch again would not end well for her. Karen tried to argue, but her words carried no weight anymore. The sheriff simply tipped his hat to me and left. Karen stood there fuming, her face red, her fists clenched, but she had no more allies to lean on. I watched her storm away down the road, her anger burning hot enough to choke her pride. Yet even as she disappeared over the hill, I knew this was not the last time she would try to strike back. Karen was too stubborn, too obsessed with power to simply walk away. And I could feel deep in my gut that her next move would be far more dangerous than the last. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I sat on the porch and thought about the day. The quiet of the ranch should have been peaceful, but there was a tension in the air that I could not ignore. Karen was plotting. I could feel it, like a storm building on the horizon. The way she had stormed off told me she was not finished, she was only regrouping. I fed the horses and checked the fence lines, making sure everything was secure. The old barn stood tall against the fading light, its weathered boards a reminder of how much this land had endured through generations of my family. It had seen storms and droughts, it had stood through wars and changing times, and now it stood against Karen. Later that night, I heard the sound of a car slowing down on the gravel road outside. I stepped into the shadows of the porch and watched headlights flicker through the trees. The car paused as if someone was watching the house before driving off into the darkness. My jaw tightened. I knew it was Karen or someone working with her, testing the boundaries, seeing if I was paying attention. The next morning, I went into town, and word was already buzzing. At the feed store, a neighbor told me Karen had been bragging that she would soon have control of the ranch. She was talking about new developments and plans for luxury cabins, as if the land was already hers. People listened, but most shook their heads. They knew the ranch belonged to me, and that Karen was biting off more than she could chew. Still, I could tell her lies were spreading, and lies had a way of turning into dangerous ideas if left unchecked. When I returned home, there was a letter pinned to my front gate. The handwriting was sharp and rushed, a warning that I should step down before things got ugly. I folded the letter and slid it into my pocket, my eyes scanning the tree line around the property. Karen was moving faster now, pushing harder, and drawing in anyone foolish enough to believe her. The game was no longer just about property. It was about control, power, and pride. And I knew the next time she showed up at the ranch, she would not come alone. 2 days later, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. This time it was not a single car, but 3 of them lined up one after another. Karen stepped out of the first one, her sunglasses perched on her face, even though the clouds were heavy overhead. Behind her came 2 men in suits and a younger woman holding a clipboard. Their stiff movements made it clear they were not here for friendly conversation. Karen called out in a voice that carried across the open space, as if she already owned the air itself. She said they were here to assess the property for violations. I walked toward the gate, calm, steady, letting the silence of the land speak louder than her words. The horses in the pasture lifted their heads, and the dogs barked from the porch as if they knew something was wrong. Karen kept her chin high, pointing at the barn and the fences and the house as if she was a queen giving orders. Her hired people started scribbling notes without even asking my permission to step onto the land. I raised my hand and told them to stop, my voice even but firm. I reminded them this was private property and that no one was allowed to enter without my approval. Karen scoffed. She said as president of the HOA she had authority to inspect anything she wanted. The suits nodded like puppets, agreeing with every word she said. But I leaned closer, my eyes fixed on hers, and told her the truth. I was not just a homeowner here, I was the new president, elected legally and properly by the community. The men hesitated, looking at each other, unsure what to do. Karen froze for a moment, but quickly covered it with a fake laugh, saying my words meant nothing. I pulled out the official papers, the same ones that confirmed my position, the documents signed, sealed, and filed with the county. Her face went pale for just a second before she snapped at the others to keep writing. But they did not move anymore. Their pens hovered above the paper, waiting for her to give an order she could no longer give. The silence stretched heavy across the yard. The only sound was the wind moving through the old oak trees that lined the property. Karen's confidence cracked, and her voice trembled, though she tried to hide it. She realized she had no power here, not anymore, and every second that passed made it clearer to the people she brought with her. Karen took a step back, her shoes crunching on the gravel louder than they should have. The two men in suits shifted uncomfortably, glancing from me to her as if waiting for instructions she could no longer give. The young woman with the clipboard lowered it slowly, her eyes wide with the realization that she had been dragged into something she did not fully understand. I stayed calm, letting the weight of the silence settle over everyone. Karen finally broke it, her voice higher, now almost desperate, as she said that none of this mattered, that she still had influence, and that she would call an emergency meeting to have me removed. I shook my head and told her there was no rule, no bylaw, no vote that could undo what the community had already decided. She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, the sound fading into the wide open fields around us. The men in suits cleared their throats, and one of them finally spoke, saying they had been hired under the impression that Karen had the right to order an inspection. Now that they knew the truth, they could not legally proceed. Karen whipped her head toward him, her eyes narrowing, but he stood firm. The young woman with the clipboard quietly stepped back, her pen sliding into her pocket, as if she wanted no part of this anymore. I told Karen she could leave, or she could stay, and face the embarrassment of being reminded again and again that she was no longer in control. Her lips trembled with fury, but for once she had no sharp comeback, no cutting remark. The ranch stood behind me, steady and strong, a living reminder that the land had been here long before her, and it would remain long after. The wind carried the smell of hay and the sound of the horses shifting in the pasture. Karen finally turned on her heel, muttering under her breath as she marched back to her car. The men followed more quietly, their footsteps uncertain, while the young woman gave me one last glance, almost apologetic, before leaving too. Engines started, and one by one the cars rolled down the driveway, their dust fading into the horizon. But even as they left, I knew this was not the end of Karen's fight. Her pride was too heavy, her need for control too strong to let her walk away completely. The question now was how far she was willing to go to reclaim power that no longer belonged to her. I watched the dust settle over the long gravel drive, the sound of the engines fading until there was only silence. The quiet was almost heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what might come next. I leaned against the old wooden fence, the boards weathered from generations of use, and let my eyes wander across the pasture. The horses grazed peacefully, unaware of the storm that had just passed through, and the cattle moved slowly in the distance, like nothing had changed. But I knew better. Karen was not finished, not by a long shot. She thrived on conflict, it fueled her, and gave her purpose, and being stripped of control was something she would never accept easily. I thought back to the meeting where the community had elected me president, the way so many neighbors had voiced their frustrations about her heavy-handed rules, her endless demands, her obsession with power. They had looked to me with hope in their eyes, believing I could bring balance back to their lives. That hope weighed on me now, heavier than Karen's glares or threats ever could. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, I heard the faint crunch of tires again. My chest tightened for a moment, thinking she had returned, but instead it was Tom, my nearest neighbor, pulling up in his old pickup. He stepped out with a slow smile, tipping his hat as he walked up. He said he had seen the parade of cars leave and figured Karen had made another scene. I nodded and told him the truth. She had tried to push me off the ranch with nothing but her words and the company of strangers who had no real authority. Tom chuckled low, saying that was just like her, always fighting battles she had already lost. But then his smile faded, and he grew serious. He warned me that Karen would not stop here, that she would likely start whisper campaigns at the meetings or dig into old land records looking for any mistake she could twist into leverage. I already knew he was right. The question was not if she would strike again, but when and how. And deep down, a part of me welcomed it, because this land was not just my home, it was my legacy, and I was ready to defend it no matter how many times she came knocking. The evening settled around us, with a calm that felt almost deceptive. Tom leaned on the fence beside me, and together we watched the last of the sunlight slip behind the trees. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, and the smell of fresh hay drifted across the pasture. Tom said he had lived here all his life, and he had seen plenty of people like Karen come and go. People who thought they could bend others to their will with rules and fear. He said they always burned themselves out eventually, because the land had a way of humbling those who did not respect it. I listened closely to his words because they carried the kind of truth you only earn with years of living close to the soil. Still, I knew Karen was different. She was stubborn and calculating, and she thrived on stirring chaos just to see how far she could push before someone broke. As the night grew darker, I walked back toward the cabin, my boots crunching against the gravel. The old porch light flickered on as I stepped onto the wooden planks, and I stood there for a moment listening to the stillness of my property. I could almost feel the history in the air. Generations of my family had walked these same steps, raised their children here, fought to keep the ranch standing through drought, storms, and hardship. That history was my shield and my strength. Inside, I lit a lamp and sat down at the heavy oak table that had belonged to my grandfather. I laid out the HOA documents Karen had been waving around earlier and began to study them carefully. Page after page was filled with rules and regulations written to intimidate people who did not know their rights. But as I read, I began to see the holes. Karen had overstepped in more ways than one, and if she tried to drag this into a legal fight, she would find herself standing on very shaky ground. The thought gave me a quiet sense of satisfaction. But even then, I knew this was not over. Karen was already planning her next move somewhere in the dark, and I had to be ready for it when it came. The next morning, the sun rose over the ranch, casting golden light across the fields. I saddled up my horse and rode the fence line, breathing in the crisp air and letting the land remind me why I fought so hard to protect it. When I returned to the cabin, a black SUV was parked out front, and Karen stood beside it with two other HOA board members. Her arms were crossed, and she wore that smug look that told me she thought she had won. Before she could speak, the county sheriff pulled up in his patrol truck and stepped out. The sheriff nodded at me first, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I have reviewed your complaints and your so-called claims," he said firmly. "This ranch is private property and has been in this family for over a century. The HOA has no authority here, and you will cease this harassment immediately." Karen's face turned pale. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The sheriff continued, "If you or any member of your board trespass again, there will be consequences. Do I make myself clear?" Karen stammered a faint yes before lowering her eyes. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, then quickly urged her back into the SUV. Without another word, they drove off, leaving a trail of dust behind them. The sheriff tipped his hat and said, "You got nothing to worry about here. You stand your ground. This land is yours." As his truck disappeared down the road, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The ranch was safe. The cabin stood strong just as it always had, and the land was mine to protect for generations to come. Karen would think twice before crossing me again. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to truly breathe in peace, knowing I had defended my family's legacy and come out stronger than before.